I was fanboying about your book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And I really lapped it up when I read it the back end of last year. I learned about it through Rod Dreher, who I believe is a personal friend of yours, and he was writing about it on his Substack. And within the book, you write about the history of humanity's search for identity and meaning. And within it, I suppose you're trying to put forward the idea that elite thought impacts the way that we search for identity and meaning and how we see ourselves in the world. And within it, you try to create or leads to the conclusion that it's our cultural elites of today and recent decades and centuries that have ultimately brought the rise of this you do you culture, create your own meaning, be really expressive in your individualism, and the idea that all we see in the world is all there is. We've also witnessed a sexual revolution, and that's laid at the feet, I suppose, of elites past and present, and also this idea of cultural amnesia that we've come to forget our own particular histories and ways of being, and that's through either denigration, destruction, and purposeful erasure, or just a letting go whilst we've pursued the pleasures of the present. And anyway, you say that the changes in our social environment and how we see ourselves in the world are brought about by a social imaginary, and I think we should linger on that for a second. So, Carl, what is a social imaginary? How do elites form them, and what is ours made of now?
Yeah, well, the term social imaginary, it's a very important concept. It's a little awkward because we generally use imaginary as an adjective. And in the social imaginary, we're using it as a noun. But the term was really coined by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. So, he doesn't coin a very elegant term. We're doomed to have to use it. But social imaginary Taylor deploys it to try to get at an issue that, when you think about it, it's kind of puzzling. And the puzzling question would be, why do so many people, for example, today, not believe in God? It's not because they've read the great tomes of atheism. It's not because they've been persuaded by an argument. It's more because they've been taught to imagine the world and their place in it in a certain way. The social imaginary is getting at the idea that most of what all of us believe at some level is the result not of arguments, but of, for want of a better term, ways of life. Our intuitions about the world are deeply shaped by rituals, by things we see on the TV, by stories we tell or are told. That the way we think is not the result of sitting down, reading an argument, and being persuaded by it. It's the way we were brought up. It's what we were taught at school. It's what we see on the television. It's what we talk about when we're down the pub. So social imaginary on one level it's a somewhat vague term, but the idea is to get us to think that actually the way that we think is not rooted necessarily in logic and principles, so much as it is rooted in the intuitions that the culture has shaped within us.
That's clear. That's about as clear a definition of something vaguely academic as you can get. So well done, because I am not a man of nutshells, and every time someone responds with a nutshell, I'm dumbfounded, because I think I'd spend an hour on that. So what is ours constituted of now? What are the various ways of thought that we apply to the world? And could you give us a whistle-stop tour of how ours came to be the way it is? Who are the key protagonists?
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting story. I mean, if we were to go back to the Middle Ages, I mean, one of the best ways of realizing how we think about ourselves today is to go back and reflect on how people would have thought about themselves 500, 600, 700 years ago. Look at the social imaginary back then. Well, if you were born in, let's say, my home village in Gloucestershire in the year 1200, certain things would be true. Your identity would be almost entirely given to you. You'd belong to a certain family. You would not have a choice of career. Hey, born the son of the local blacksmith, guess what you're going to be when you grow up? You're going to be the blacksmith. You're going to be baptized married and buried in the same church that your ancestors and all your other friends in the village will be baptized, married, and buried in. You're probably not going to travel in the entirety of your life more than 40 miles from where you were born. So, if you're born in Gloucestershire, Bath would be at the outer limits of your universe. Oxford might be, if you went to Oxford once in your life, that would be an exceptional journey. Well, think about that, how that makes you think about yourself. It gives you a very stable identity in a lot of ways. If you were to say to me, who are you? I'd say, well, I'm the son of so-and-so. I live in such and such a village. My family's trade is this. And I am, if you'd say to me, well, hey, do you fancy doing this? I might say to you, well, actually, I can't do that because I'm part of this family. I'm obliged to my family at this point. I can't just choose my career path for myself or choose where I'm going to live. I have obligations. And I would say that the social imaginary in the Middle Ages is really one of fixed points of external authority. And of course, that's reinforced by the rhythm of life. Every year you go through the 4 seasons. If you were to do an experiment, if we're able to time travel between 1200, 1300 and 1400 in my home village of Gloucestershire, the faces would have changed. The families and the names would not have done. There'd be less change between Gloucestershire in the year 1200 and 1400 than in London or New York between 2010 and 2024. The solidity of the world shapes how you think about it and your place in it. Move to the present day. Almost none of those things that I've talked about apply anymore. I don't think of space as solid and authoritative. This time last week, I was in Montana, 2,000 miles to the west. I thought nothing of hopping on a plane and doing that. I live 4,000 miles from where I grew up. I chose my career. My dad was a chartered accountant. I'm a professor at a liberal arts college. Everything about me is a matter of choice. And the world around me is also one of tremendous flux and change. And I would suggest, the big difference, the big thing about the modern self is this. My imagination tells me that I'm free and autonomous, that I'm not defined by natural obligations towards others. I'm not defined by being stuck in a place. I'm not even defined by time in the same way as, say, my ancestors were, because they were peasant farmers and dependent upon the seasons. I can teach anywhere, anytime I wish, not seasonally dependent. So the big shift is one, I think, from, I would say, thinking of myself as my identity as deriving from obligations and dependencies to thinking of myself as autonomous, free, self-defining. Now, the intellectual narrative, we could look at a figure like Rousseau. Rousseau, when he writes his autobiography, says, all I need to do is look inside. All I got to do is think about my feelings at any given point. And Rousseau also in his political philosophy will argue for a form of autonomy. A man is born free and everywhere is in chains. No man in the Middle Ages thought he was born free. And what I would say, the way we get to the modern world is that the kind of that libertarian understanding of what it means to be human becomes plausible in the kind of technological world in which we now find ourselves. And in some ways, that's great. I enjoy the job I do. I love living in a world where, hey, if I go for a minor operation, they can give me an anesthetic and I'm not dying of pain on the... So it's not a Luddite argument so much as an argument to say, technology and the things that come with it has profoundly transformed not merely my life, but the way I imagine myself to be as a human being.
Yeah, that is a point which I saw totally encapsulated by Harold Macmillan. I saw a clip of the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Harold Macmillan, not long before he passed away. And the clip was very short. And he was on a talk show and he was asked what were the most transformational things that happened to him throughout the course of his career. And he responded something like this. It wasn't about what's happened in my career, but rather I was born in the age of the horse and cart trundling up and down the street, and I die in the age of the aeroplane. I mean, it's actually mind-boggling. The points you're making about having this identity ascribed to you when you're born, if we're looking at the Middle Ages up until probably that period which Harold Macmillan died in to a degree. And then now we're surrounded by the achieved identity culture, right? Everyone's trying to build their resumes. They're all trying to show how they're particularly unique and achieve their characteristics. And a little personal anecdote here is I'm from the northeast of England, and I'd left school early. And when I did that, I was working in some retail jobs, and I was looking at all of my peers who had gone on to university, pretty much most of them. This is post Tony Blair education policy. And they were all going to get their achieved identities. And I was feeling pretty left behind. So in the end, I thought I'm going to have to shake a tail feather here and get out of my small town, because I don't have any credentials, as it were. And my options are more supermarkets or the wood chip factory. I didn't fancy any of those. So I decided I'd go and work in some shops in Manchester instead. So that's where I went. But the thing that was driving me was I need to go and do something which is going to ultimately shake me up the career ladder, which might give me a sense of achievement and try and sort myself out. And over time, I started to explore academic interests and get better jobs or whatever. But there was a point when I found myself back in my home environment of Northumberland. Lockdown had hit. We've all scuttled off back home because no one fancied staying in London. And yeah, I've been jumping around rootless. And I was feeling rootless without ever having put the money on it as to exactly what it was that I was feeling. But when I got home and I started to explore the place that I was from, and I started to engage with the history of how the Northumbrian peoples and the English peoples and all the culture came to be, and the spirituality and every aspect of it, I suddenly started to feel rooted and like I belonged, whereas before I felt like this atom that was bouncing around.
Yeah, I mean, and it makes perfect sense, because we are people who crave roots, and I think there's a sense in which technology has been, as I said before, I'm not a Luddite. I think there've been many great things about technology, not least, we're able to talk to each other now. We're thousands of miles apart, but we're having an enjoyable conversation. But one of the things that technology has done, it has put us in a kind of frictionless world in some ways. It's downplayed the importance of the body. And there's a certain importance to the body to which you're alluding here. To be in a certain place at a certain time is also important. It's great to chat online as we're doing now, but how much greater would it be to be in a pub, sharing a drink? I talk to my mother, every week or so on the telephone. It's great to hear her voice. How much greater is it for me to actually sit in her front room and have a cup of tea? Space is important. And even as technology has attenuated dramatically the authority of space, it remains something that is important to human beings. So it's very striking the way you talk about your sort of pilgrimage there as an attempt to find roots, because that pilgrimage is intimately connected, it seems to me, to also being in a place, having a network of friends, having an identity that is recognized in the locale and not just online.